want people to understand what many New Yorkers already know, and that is that his father, at one point, was the guy that ran and established a history in that seat. He was a renowned clergyman, a kind of larger-than-life figure in the life of Harlem and New York City's black community. Held that seat for a long time until he was beaten by the incumbent, Charlie Rangel, who has held that seat for 40 years. Along comes Adam Clayton Powell IV, running against Rangel, so it has a kind of almost epic, dramatic proportion to all of this. Now, of course, you're not the only candidate, but you're the one that has that name. And I think some people would say, well, is this you're running for the legacy? Is it because you feel that somehow that seat belongs to you or your family? What would you say to that?
That's all the wrong approach. I mean, that's like saying that, let's say if George Pataki was still governor and Andrew Cuomo were running against Pataki, is that because his father was governor and was defeated with George Pataki? It has nothing to do with any of that. Listen, if the congressman decided tomorrow not to run for re-election, I'd be just as enthusiastic about representing Northern Manhattan in the Congress. Listen, I've been in public service for nearly 20 years, in the city council in the 1990s, in the state assembly over the last 10 years. So if I had any other name, it would still be a natural progression to go to the federal level and represent my people in the Congress. So it has nothing to do with my dad or Rangel or anything.
So do you feel any particular pressure on the other end of
no,
it?
What I
because
feel,
it
no,
was
what
your
I
dad
feel,
who
no,
established that
no,
legacy?
What I feel is that the media just focuses way too much on that instead of focusing on the fact that I personally have a record. For better or for worse, I personally have been in the city council for 6 years. I personally have served in the state assembly for 10 years. And so it's just...
and your father had nothing to do with any of that?
Exactly, because he was deceased. He died when I was 8 years old. And so what I've done, of course, I have a legacy, undoubtedly. What I've done knocking on doors, walking the streets, going to senior centers, talking to people. And I've been there for the last 10 years. So it's not like I just parachuted here today and say, gee, I want to go to Congress. It's not like that. And if any other candidate for this office were running, none of those questions would be asked. Or let's say if Rangel was not the congressman. Like I said, if he decided to, which is possible, if he decided not to run tomorrow and announced he wasn't running, then maybe some of those questions will go away, and I would just be just as enthusiastic about representing Northern Manhattan.
We'll come back to all that kind of stuff, but again, a little bit more about background.
Okay.
You spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico.
Yes, I grew up in Puerto Rico, born and raised.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
It was wonderful.
And how much you identify as a Puerto Riqueño as well as, quote, an African American.
Bicultural, very proud of my existence. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. As I mentioned before, my father passed away when I was a little boy. And so I grew up with my mother in Santurce, Puerto Rico, like any other Boricua kid. Entonces, I came to the mainland, so to speak, to go to college.
How old were you when you came?
17. Came to go to college like many kids do, get a 4-year, and then go back to Puerto Rico. Well, lo and behold, during those 4 years, I fell in love, not only with the mainland, but fell in love with an individual. I got married. I started to want to go back to my father's roots, to my roots on my father's side, shall I say. And so that brought me to New York, obviously, where you know, he was established and where my roots are on my father's side. And I've been here all of my adult life, which is now 27, 28 years. And that's my story in a nutshell.
Well, you know, there's been a legacy of that seat that you're running for, as to, in many people's minds, first of all, as the Harlem seat. And closely tied to that, the idea that somehow it's a black seat. Now, you and I know, and others that are involved in covering and knowing about city politics, that today that seat, in terms of population, it goes well beyond Harlem geographically, number one. Number two, that Latinos, for example, pretty much outnumber blacks in that district by about 2 to 1. So how do you see it? Is it still a black seat?
No, it's... I don't think I put labels on any of these districts, so I wouldn't think this was a black seat even in the past. And certainly it's not a Harlem seat. Harlem is one of several neighborhoods in this district. You have the Upper West Side, which is completely separate and apart. You have Washington Heights, which is completely separate. You have Inwood, which is completely different. You have East Harlem, which is not really part of the central Harlem that people think of most of the time. And so,
AKA El Barrio.
El Barrio, that's right. El Barrio, Spanish Harlem, which I've been privileged to represent for nearly 20 years. That's why, you know, started in the city council and now in the assembly. And so this district, Harlem, is just but one piece of the puzzle, which is smack in the middle of it. And somehow, you know, the rest of the neighborhoods appear to be stepchildren. And that's wrong. And that's one of the equations that my candidacy and my election will change.